here on this evening. And so I am Geneva Adams, and I am going to open us up tonight with the prayer. So if you will all just be kind and bow your heads. Dear righteous Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you for this day. We thank you for this opportunity to educate others about the census. Lord, we ask that we have a clear understanding. We come with open minds and questions are answered. In Jesus' name we pray, amen.
Amen.
And at this time, I'm going to turn the floor over to our president, Karen White, for greetings.
Good evening, and welcome to Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated South Bend Alumni Chapter Educational Forum entitled What We Don't Know About the Census. As president of the South Bend Alumni Chapter, I would like to thank each and every one of you who have joined us in person or those who will be joining us virtually. Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated was founded on January the 13th, 1913, by 22 collegiate women at Howard University to promote academic excellence and provide assistance to those in needs. Founded on Christian principles with sisterhood, scholarship, and service at the core of our work. For over 100 years, Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated has been an organization of college-educated women who have committed to the constructive development of its members and to public service, with a primary focus on the Black community. We have withstood the test of time, and we pride ourselves by providing and following in the footsteps of our founders. And we remain in the forefront of actions as a voice for those in need. Since 1790, the federal government has embarked on a very tremendous task every 10 years to count every man, woman, and child living in the United States. The 2020 census will provide a snapshot of our nation, who we are, where we live, and so much more. The 2020 census will provide data that will impact communities for the next decade, inform hundreds of millions in federal funding and provide that funding every year. And also it will determine congressional representation. I wish to thank our presenters, Mr. Joseph Molnar, Mr. Michael Divita, Community Investment Department, for leading this very important discussion. Also, I would like to acknowledge the Civil Rights Heritage Center, George, for really being with us and to helping us with the technology. Again, thank you so much and welcome to What You Don't Know About the Census.
Good evening. My name is Deborah Walker, the chairperson for DST Political Awareness and Involvement. Once again, I would like to thank you for attending this educational session on the census. The census tells us who we are, where we're going as a nation, and it helps our community determine where we build everything from schools, stores, hospitals, homes, and more. As a member of DST, it is our charge to use the power of our voices to educate and serve the community at large. And tonight's topic will serve you well. To those who are presenting, to those who are present, to those who are watching virtually, sit back, take notes from our panelists, and see how the census affects us in our daily lives. And be sure to pass this information on to others as well. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Deborah Carroll, and I'm here to introduce our Mistress of Ceremony. Rose Clark is a lifelong resident of South Bend, Indiana. graduate of St. Joseph High School, she furthered her education at Purdue University, earning a BA in 1983 and her MSW in 1999. Graduating with distinction, she was also selected as the 1999 MSW Student of the Year. Following graduation, she returned to the South Bend area where she was employed with the South Bend Tribune. Mrs. Clark entered into the social service arena when she became employed with the Project Head Start. She became involved and committed to working with underrepresented population. Mrs. Clark's primary focus is providing the life of youth. Keeping her mission, Rose Clark is currently a school social worker with School City of Mishawaka and a therapist at Imani Unidad. She is passionate about providing voice to the voiceless. Rose Clark is a proud member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. She served on the LaSalle Area Neighborhood Association Board and the board of the YMCA Urban Youth Service. She is also a member of NAACP. Please give a warm welcome to Mrs. Rose Clark.
Good evening.
Good evening.
It's always wonderful to have people clap for you. As my sorors have said, our purpose today is to educate as well as provide direction and explore the importance of data collection and examine how the impact of the census will change what we do on the federal, state, and local levels. So it's very important. And sometimes we don't understand just how important it is. So I did a little research before I put it over to my esteemed panel. There are some 10 common things that people misunderstand or understand about the census. So if I ask you all, will you be able to tell us if this is true or false, because you're the expert?
We'll let Mike go.
Okay. One of the first things that I wanted to know, does a census form include a question about citizenship?
Okay.
Initially, was that somewhere somebody was trying to get that on the ballot?
Yes.
Okay. Is the start of census collection on April 1st, Census Day?
Yes.
Well, it starts just slightly before that, but it should be based on that day.
Okay. Does census only count US citizens?
Nope.
No.
Anyone living here.
Okay. Now this shocked me. Is your individual identifiable data confidential forever?
Not forever.
70 for 72 years. It is.
72, probably dead by then. Okay, that's good. Was the 2020 census the first time the census is online?
Yeah.
Yes, so what?
Yes. Yes.
Is the census voluntary?
So required by law.
It's required by law. So if you don't do it, you're breaking the law.
Correct.
That's right.
Okay. On the census, is Hispanic and Latino considered a race?
No.
Nope.
Okay. And my final question, is the census the same as American Community Survey?
No, it's administered by the same group, some of the same sorts of questions, but a different survey or product that's done.
Okay, well, that answered my 10 questions. So I'm turning it over now to the experts to further educate us on what the census is about.
And I'm returning because I'm going to introduce who our actual panelists are on this evening. So first we have Joseph Molnar, is the zoning specialist for the City of South Bend, Department of Community Investment, of political science and history degree from the University of St. Francis. He has contributed efforts to update and reform the zoning ordinance and processes. Joseph is also the author of a series of More People, How South Bend Lost 50,000 People in 50 Years, and has worked to analyze and better understand demographic changes in South Bend, giving multiple presentations to local libraries and universities, including IUSB and the University of Notre Dame. Michael Devito is principal planner and with the City of South Bend Department of Community Investment. In his 20 years with the city, Michael has implemented nationally recognized projects in the neighborhood planning, streetscape, work, and zoning reform. Holding a planning degree from Michigan State University, he has managed efforts to revitalize areas along Western Avenue and Lincolnway West. Please welcome our panelists on this evening. We're so glad to have you. And I'm turning the floor back over to our Mistress of Ceremony.
Okay, I see up here that you're ready to
Yeah,
do
we're ready to
a
go.
PowerPoint.
Yes. So we should begin.
You can.
All right. Now I'm going to turn a little bit so I can make sure I'm pushing the slide at the right time. Thank you for the introduction and for having Mike and I here today. This is a presentation we initially developed primarily for the city council and the city administration as a whole, so that our elected officials could know what we discovered in the 2020 census. Thank you, Deborah, for those 10 questions. I think that even jarred my mind a little bit. So primarily, this presentation focuses on what we learned in the 2020 census and where South Bend is moving forward. It's specifically designed for the city of South Bend. That's the main data that's collected, but there is some more about St. Joe County as a whole, the city of Mishawaka, and the nation as large. But I think before we start talking about what the 2020 census told us, I think we need to remember where we were in 2010 at the previous census. This is what we learned from the census in 2010. We knew that South Bend lost over 6,000 people, almost 7,000 people. We knew that for the first time ever in the city of South Bend's history, we lost households. So the definition of a household is essentially an occupied unit. So if you are a single person living in an apartment, you are one household. If you are a family of 6 living in a house, that is one household. South Bend had never lost households in its entire nearly 200-year history until the decade of the 2000s. We also know that vacant housing doubled in that decade as well, going from about 3,500 to almost 7,000 vacant homes. So it was not a very good report in 2010. And that 2010 report was really part of a larger story. Starting in 1960, South Bend began to lose population. This is South Bend's population history dating back to 1840 to 2010. As you can see, right in 1960, it peaks a little over 130,000 people and then started a slow downward trunk ever since about 50 years. The 2010 census, again, was the one where we actually lost households, including people. But where did everybody go? I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about when a city loses population. What does that look like? People always assume like, oh, it's probably people moving south for the warm weather. There's obviously a lot of that going on in the Midwest. But I think if you look at the bigger county picture, you can really see where residents in South Bend were moving to. These two graphs here, the blue line is that same South Bend's population trajectory from 1840 to 2010. The yellow line is the rest of St. Joe County. So everything outside of the city of South Bend. As you can see, starting in about 1920, it's been on an almost vertical line up ever since. So even though South Bend City peaked in 1960 and has been declining since, the county outside, essentially the suburbs and the city of Mishawaka, have been doing quite fine since 1920. So I think a lot of times people blame the population decline on Studebaker closing, on manufacturing leaving. Well, that happened countywide. but we didn't necessarily see that flight from St. Joe County as a whole, but specifically from the city of South Bend to the suburbs and to Mishawaka. And that graph I showed you actually is a rosier picture than it really is. Because in 1960, our city limits looked like this. This is a map of the city of South Bend. The yellow shaded area, that is what the city of South Bend city limits were in 1960. The yellow outline that's larger, that is our city limits today. As you can see, we had 132,000 people in that shaded area in 1960. Today, even if you include all the areas we've annexed and grown, we're only at 100, or we are at 101,000. If you just look at the shaded areas in 2010, we are at 86,000 people. So almost 50,000 people left the core of the city over those 50 years. So going into the 2010s, where were we as a city? Well, we had over 6,500 vacant homes. We had high unemployment. Try to remember back to what the Great Recession was like. For 3 years straight, the city of South Bend had over 12% unemployment. There were severe population declines, and they were concentrated in neighborhoods. In this neighborhood we are in today and others like it on the west side and on the southeast side specifically. And housing values were cut by more than 50% across the majority of the city. While today we're dealing with almost the opposite, where affordable housing is becoming harder and harder to find in the city and the country as a whole. 15 years ago, the city was dealing with the fact that our houses were losing value very, very fast, and homeowners found themselves underwater on their mortgages. So that was a recap of what we were going into in the 2010 census. Mike is going to take that and ask some questions about what you think happened in the 2020 census.
Well, Stan, so you can hear me a little better. I guess we already got one pop quiz, but we'll give it right back. It can't be an educational opportunity without a pop quiz. So want to see here, to start thinking about the census locally. A question, can you rank these geographies by fastest growth to slowest growth between 2010 and 2020 in percentage terms? So I have the city of South Bend, the city proper of Mishawaka, Granger, and then the rest of St. Joe County outside of those three. I'll give you half a second to think. Then maybe at least for those in the room, maybe call out what you think number one, the fastest growing of those four is. Okay. Okay, I hear a lot of Granger and St. Joe County. How about maybe second? What would you think? Mishawaka. Okay, third. And the slowest of the four? Yeah, it is. Yeah. So it seemed like mostly Granger and the county toward the top, and South Bend maybe toward the bottom. While that's been true for a lot of the last half century, that's not what we saw in the last 10 years. So between 2010 and 2020, Mishawaka grew by 5.8%, City of South Bend by 2.3%. The county outside of South Bend, Mishawaka, and Granger grew by 1.2%. And Granger itself declined in population over the decade by about 0.5%. And we'll get a little bit more into why that is here in a bit. So second question, what was South Bend's fastest growing neighborhood in percentage terms since the prior census? Southside, East. Okay. I don't know. I would think maybe people, a common answer would be kind of northeast side. We've seen all the growth in new housing around Notre Dame. We've seen some of that too downtown on the East Bank, but none of those are the right answer. It's actually here, kind of near West Side area, so near the city cemetery, just I guess starting across the street from us in north. This is Census Tract 19, so areas between Washington Street and Lincolnway West, from west edge of downtown near William out to Walnut. Some of that's because there's new housing here. Some of you may be familiar with the South Bend Mutual Homes project that got built in this neighborhood to add a lot of housing units. So grew about 25% of this neighborhood in population, or adding 278 residents. And probably also some of the housing that was previously vacant at the time of the 2010 census got reoccupied. There is Tract 10, which is the northeast neighborhood that did grow fastest in terms of absolute numbers, adding over 600 residents, but not quite the same rate as this neighborhood. So we'll get beyond the quizzes and beyond the context from 10 years ago and dive into the 2020 numbers here now. So kind of top line, some of the headlines. South Bend is a growing city. So the 2020 census population was 103,453. So as I mentioned, South Bend grew at 2.3% for the decade. That is slower growth than the United States as a whole, a little over 7%, although that's kind of a historically low number for the nation. The state grew at 4.7%. We also want to compare South Bend to places kind of like us. Joe did a fantastic job of putting this together. So he looked for kind of cities kind of around the Midwest that had a population between 100 and 200,000 in 1960, the largest city in their county. They were a manufacturing-based economy and had experienced at least one decade of population decline. So as the list here, so you see actually among its peers, South Bend does pretty well. Of most of the places that kind of have the profile of South Bend still have declining populations. So you know, even places kind of very comparable with Evansville or Peoria, South Bend did better than certainly better than some of what you think of some of the very struggling Rust Belt type places like Youngstown or Gary or Flint. So with the highlights, so South Bend added close to 2,300 people. This was actually the fastest in percentage terms and the largest in absolute terms, the growth that the city has seen since the 1950s. So Joe kind of previewed this chart earlier, adding in the last decade here. So the last 10 years was only the second time since 1960 that South Bend had a population increase from the previous census. The other time was in the 1990s, but between 2010 and 2020, the city grew faster than it did in the 1990s. We'll cover a bit more in depth here, but the growth was pretty broad across the city. So it wasn't really just concentrated in like one or two spots. So that was an interesting trend. And again, something hadn't really seen in a very long time in South Bend. And South Bend is still the fourth largest city in the state. There was some idea with the fast growing Indianapolis suburbs of Carmel and Fishers that they might overtake South Bend. Those two places ended up just a little under 100,000. So at least for another 10 years, we'll hold our ranking. So some of those trends that, you know, at least for this decade, were reversed. So the majority of growth in the city happened in established neighborhoods. So Joe had showed that map of what the 1960s city limits looked like. So most of the growth was within those neighborhoods. So the only other decade since 1960 where we saw growth, again, was the 1990s. Most of that growth was really at the edges of the city, but that wasn't so much the case here. So it's the first time then that kind of yellow shaded area grew in population since prior to 1960. And that area also grew faster than or added more growth than the rest of the city outside of the area. So urban areas added more people than suburban areas did in South Bend. So downtown and the neighborhoods immediately adjacent to it grew by a 4.7%. So it's a faster clip than the city as a whole. Again, there it's the largest growth that those saw since at least the 1950s. And over the decade, South Bend annexed very little additional land and almost no new residential land. So the city limits were fairly static over the decade. So with kind of the same geography and a larger population, that means for the first time again since the 1950s, South Bend's population density increased. I wanted to highlight here the census does kind of census tracts, so it collects or releases data at the level of about a neighborhood. So there's roughly about 40 census tracts within the city of South Bend that they use as their statistical units. And what we had seen coming into this last census, there were 10 census tracts in the city that had declined in population every single census. So the population in 1970 was less than 1960, and the population in 1980 was less than 1970, and so on. So these places had kind of a half century of kind of nonstop decline. So those are tracts here. This is Lincolnway. So kind of parts of the northwest and northern part of the near west side, as well as the southeast side, kind of area around Riley and Ivy Tech. Also, one place you might not think of, tract 12, so kind of around the McKinley School area on the east side, and this south side tracts, kind of around O'Brien Center and Miami Hills, that area. So of those 10 tracts with this census, 9 of them grew. So for the first time, kind of reversing that trend. So the only one that didn't was that south side tract. So these are some kind of heartening to see some of the tracts, neighborhoods that have hardest hit over the last 50 years. At least had one good decade here, and then we hope to see that continue. Also then, South Bend, as we saw in our maybe pop quiz at the start, South Bend grew faster than St. Joseph County as a whole. The last time we saw that happen was with the 1920 census. So the first time in 100 years, the city grew faster than the county as a whole. So looking at that in more detail, county grew by 2.2% as a whole, so including South Bend, Mishawaka. Again, South Bend grew by 2.3% to edge it out. Mishawaka at 5.8%. St. Joseph County outside of South Bend and Mishawaka grew by 0.8%. But actually, if you take out South Bend, Mishawaka, and the census tract, like where Notre Dame is located, then the rest of the county actually declined in population by 0.3%. So like a fairly good decade for South Bend, and saw actually population declines happening more in suburban and particularly in rural areas. So that's kind of the broad overview, and now we'll go back to Joe, who will kind of drop in a little bit more depth and detail around the city.
Thanks, Mike. So yeah, a lot of those numbers, they kind of wash over you when you get so many in a row. So this is at a very broad-based visual level. What are we looking at? So this is a map of St. Joe County. So down here is Walkerton, to give you some perspective, and that is downtown right there, number 17. And then this is Granger, to kind of give you a perspective. So as you can see, red means the tract of the neighborhood decline. Green means that it grew. The darker red, more decline. Darker green, more growth. This is kind of jumbled, and we'll zoom in on South Bend to try to get more perspective. But broad base here, obviously, we saw heavy declines in the rural parts of St. Joe County. This is something that we weren't necessarily expecting, and that in 2010, we had seen very large growth in these areas, but that had completely reversed, where really the only areas that saw any growth at all were the city of South Bend, the city of Mishawaka, and some of the suburban neighborhoods. Any areas that were rural in St. Joe County were losing population, some significantly over 10% even in just one decade. But to zoom in just on South Bend and to kind of get away from the tracks, because sometimes the tracks don't match up with where exactly a neighborhood you think would begin and end, we broke the city into 10 regions, and we'll go through those 10 regions to kind of explore how each area did. These are not official designations, but these are just something that we came up with to try to gauge, grouping like neighborhoods together. So first, looking at downtown, Obviously, to both the east and west banks of downtown, that grew by 2.7%, which I think some people were expecting when we were going into the census and wondering if we knew we were going to grow. We were thinking maybe downtown would have seen a larger growth, but it was actually just fairly faster than the city as a whole. But still, like Mike said, first time downtown has probably grown in 50 or 60 years or maybe much more. Going on to the east side north, so this is the area such as Edison Park, Sunnymead, and then the areas directly south of Notre Dame's campus. Well, what we saw was that the area just south of Notre Dame's campus, the northeast neighborhood, that saw really heavy growth. The neighborhoods kind of that are circle that neighborhood actually declined. Edison Park declined significantly. Sunnymead was essentially flat, and the North Shore Triangle still had significant decline. And what we found is even though those areas are going gangbusters property-wise, the North Shore Triangle has become more and more expensive. The Edison Park property values are rising. What we're actually seeing here is a rise in second homes. So Notre Dame alumni who are buying second homes, obviously if it's their second home, they're not living there. So where once a family was there, if there's no longer an out, that's a loss in population. Even though on the outside the house looks fine, they probably have someone maintain it. Even more than that, I think we're seeing is Airbnbs. So places places where people rent them out year round for game days. I know of a couple alone. My in-laws live in Edison Park, and they have two just on their street or homes in the last few years now. They're permanently short-term rentals, and that obviously has a consequence on the neighborhood. From a livability standpoint, it's not nice to live next to a place that's constantly people are treating it like a hotel. And two, you see the population of the neighborhood decline. Even though there's a demand to live in that neighborhood, people are using the houses for different purposes. So even though immediately adjacent to campus, we saw a very large growth in population, the other areas kind of dragged the east side down a bit. East side south, which is essentially River Park and the neighborhood just immediately north of it, that saw a little bit faster growth at 2.5%. River Park itself actually saw significant growth in the 5 to 6% range. What we saw was, anybody who remembers Park Jefferson, or sometimes called Spark Jefferson, that saw a significant decline in population just in that one apartment complex, and that dragged down the entire east side south. We are hoping that more units will actually come online and repairs are being made to those buildings. So if you take that apartment out, River Park actually did very well in the census. And then one of the big surprises, something we were very happy to see, is the southeast side. So like Mike said, the areas around Ivy Tech and Riley, basically from Ewing to Sample, did very well. We saw an 8.1% growth in population in that neighborhood. There's some great work being done by the organization 466 Works, building new homes. And what we're also seeing is just people are rehabbing homes that were vacant and abandoned over the last decade. So we're very excited to see neighborhoods that have lost thousands of people starting to see growth again. Then if you move to what I would call like the traditional south side, so basically Ewing here down to Ireland, that was basically flat, which is good, right? Not declining. So we're excited to see that. Then the Rum Village neighborhood saw a slight decline. So this is, I believe, Sample here, and then everything south. A slight decline, nothing crazy significant, but something that we are seeing, and we'll get into some of the reasons why. And then what we called West Side South. So here is Western Avenue, and here are the railroad tracks. So basically Sample to the railroad tracks, that saw a decline as well of 3%, which a decade ago would have been like, oh, that's actually pretty flat, pretty good. But compared to the rest of the city, those were the two areas, the Rum Village and the West Side South, that did see declining population still. Another great one, and where we are today though, the West Side North. So the railroad tracks to Portage Avenue saw 5.7% growth. Like Mike said, many of these neighborhoods have been declining for 50 years, possibly even more. We actually saw the second largest growth on the west side along the neighborhoods that bound Lincolnway West, which was very encouraging to see. And finally, the Northwest, so basically Portage to the river, about 1.9% growth. Again, pretty minimal, just about what the city did as a whole, but still encouraging that it was growing. And then finally, all the other areas that don't fit neatly into the census tract. So the far south side, basically south of the bypass, and the northwest side up by the airport, that whole area, quote unquote, like suburban South Bend, grew by 4.7%. So minimal growth, but probably some of the slowest that it's done in a long time. So that's a zoom zoom in on the city as a whole. But then what about the numbers beyond population? So the census doesn't just tell us how many people live in an area and that's it. They go into a little bit more detail. So we learned about housing units. The census goes out and they figure out how many houses, how many apartments, how many houses are in your city. And we learned that South Bend grew by almost 1,000 houses in the last decade. South Bend has never had more housing units than it does today, which I think some people wouldn't really think that, but it is true. Vacant housing. Obviously, we talked about vacant housing was one of the large things that came out of the 2010 census and the Great Recession. Obviously, there was the 1,000 Houses in 1,000 Days program of about a decade ago, which tried to deal with that. And you know, there's the controversy around that. So what happened to vacant housing in this decade? Well, vacant housing went down. It went down by 11.3%. And it actually did a little bit better than what that sounds because the Northeast saw vacant housing grow. Like we talked about with the Airbnbs and the second homes, that's vacant housing just of a different type. If you take that portion of the city out, the rest of the city, almost 20%, 18.3% decline in vacant housing. We still have a lot of vacant housing in the city of South Bend, 5,800 houses, but it is moving in the right direction. But why did vacancy decline? Why did vacant houses decline? Was it because we just tore them all down, or were it because some people started to move back into them? Well, if you look at tracks 2, 4, 5, 6, 19, and 21, that's basically those along both sides of Lincolnway West and the Southeast, where the 1,000 Houses in 1,000 Days program was most concentrated. What happened in those tracks? Well, we saw a total reduction of about 800 vacant homes. So there was 800 less vacant homes in those neighborhoods. But what we did see was a growth in occupied homes of 367. So 367 houses across those neighborhoods were occupied where they were not a decade before. But we did see a decline of total housing then of 430. So about 46% of the reduction in vacant housing was because more people rehabbed homes and came back into the neighborhoods. And the other 54% was because homes were torn down. So I like to talk about this a little bit. I'm kind of a nerd, but this is the growth of occupied housing units. So one thing that's hard with the census is because every generation people are having smaller families, you can have the same occupied houses, but your population is still declining because there's less children, or because there's maybe a single person living in the house where before, there was a family of 4. If we look at growth in occupied housing, which from a city perspective, that's what we really want, right? We want people living in our houses. We're not dictating that they have a lot of children. If a single person wants to own a home in South Bend, we want them to be able to do that too. If you look at that, the growth in actual housing units that are occupied, that is actually was really good across the city. Especially, again, this is Lincolnway West and the Southeast saw a good return in occupied housing. But again, like I said, the East Side saw declines from the Airbnbs and the second homes. Even though immediately downtown and right next to campus, we saw a large growth. Like I said, I did want to point out the Lincolnway West portion. So from a perspective of how many of those occupied houses grew, what was the growth in households? Well, South Bend's households grew by even faster than its population. It grew by 4.3%. But what we did see is that the number of people per household shrank again. This has been going on since 1840. South Bend's per household population basically shrinks every year as, again, each generation seems to have less children than the others. This is by no means unique to South Bend. This is nationwide a trend that we are almost lockstep with. We're just a tiny bit ahead. But if you see here, if you remember what I told you at the very beginning, this was the first decade, 2000 to 2010, that South Bend actually lost households. What we had seen before is most of our population decline was from the fact that our families were smaller and we weren't adding enough families to make up for that. What we saw in this last decade is we got about half of that back, which was very good to see. A little over half of those households returned. So that number makes it even look better than the population growth. These are those same 10 regions again. We won't go through all 10, but one thing to really point out is when you look at just the growth of occupied housing, the growth of households, all 10 regions grew. There was not a single area in the city of South Bend that saw a decline in the number of households. Even Rum Village and the West Side South, which had declining populations, they still grew in households, which is really good. It's just that their families were getting smaller. faster than they were adding new populations significantly. These are where we have a lot of Hispanic population in the city of South Bend, and the Hispanic growth of families is shrinking considerably faster than the nation as a whole, because they traditionally, as immigrant families move in and settle into the United States, their families shrink faster than the rest of the population. So Mike is then going to talk about what type, the demographic changes.
So probably not a surprise, but South Bend is becoming a more diverse city. Here's the breakdown. The white population within the city declined by about 10% over the decade. The Black or African American population was relatively stable. So modest gains in population American Indians and Asians. Some of it's how the census asked the questions, but did see a large increase in other or those reporting two or more races. The census question is all self-identified, so whatever you consider yourself to answer. So similar to the nation as a whole, saw large increases in those last two categories. The thought is generally especially in the other, tend to be Hispanic or Latino populations, as we covered off the top. In census terms, being Hispanic is not a race, so you could be white and Hispanic, you could be Black and Hispanic. It's kind of an ethnicity or a place of origin. So looking at race numbers over time here. Since 1960, the white population of South Bend has declined by, I think it's more than half, from about 120,000 down to below 60,000. So this would be the white-only population. So that's a large kind of reason for the city's population decline. Again, the Black or African American population is kind of generally grown to stable over that time period, with other groups gaining in population through that time. So kind of the same chart, but rather than absolute numbers, looking at it in the percentage terms, you can see that the white population was 90% of the city in 1960. It's fallen to I think around 55% in the 2020 census. So given that trend line, we'd expect by about the middle of this decade that South Bend would become a majority minority city. So that is less than half the population identifying just as white. The Hispanic or Latino population within the city has continued to grow, went from 13,000 to 17,000. So now 1 out of every 6 residents in the city identifies as Hispanic. And the rate of increase in that group in the city was faster than the nation as a whole. And I think a couple more slides here from Joe.
Yeah, we're on the home stretch, I promise. So one thing I think, the last thing we'll break it down to is the age of the people who responded to the census. South Bend's adult population growth grew by actually 4%. So if you just look at individuals aged 18 and older, that grew by 4.1%, which is faster than the city. But our 0 to 17 population, so basically the children of our community, that actually shrank by 2.7% from 27,600 to 26,000, almost 900. However, this actually matched the nation as a whole. The US adult population increased by 10%, but the child population actually decreased. So as a nation as a whole, we have less children than we did a decade ago. This is one of the stats that when I realized in the census, I was like, where are all like the articles and the news about like, we have less children than we did. You think that would be like a much bigger story, at least I think so. But the country as a whole, we're losing children. As we as a community who suffered population decline know, like when you have to close schools, when you have to do those hard decisions, that when you're losing the children in your community, that's not good. And I think it's going to have some issues for the United States going forward. But if you actually look at those communities we looked at before, Mishawaka, Granger, and the rest of the county, even though South Bend lost 2.7% of its child population, that was the best of all those areas. So something I think wouldn't have expected this before I started digging into it was Mishawaka lost almost double the percentage that we did. Granger lost 10% of its child population. We talked about how Granger actually shrank last decade. It was entirely because its child population shrank. As again, what we're seeing is if you have less and less children in each family unit, a house out in Granger that used to have 6, 2 parents and 4 kids, now only has 2 parents and 2 kids in this next generation, you're going to see that decline. This is significant for Penn Harris Madison School, as they have admitted as their share, their actual regional district, as they have less children for those schools, they are more willing to take students from South Bend and the rest of the county, which obviously leads to consequences for the South Bend schools. And then the rest of the county as a whole saw a significant loss as well. So one thing we talk about, is South Bend a good place to raise a family? We obviously have work to do. We want to make sure in the 2030 census, we're seeing our child population grow, but we're actually doing the best of our areas and making sure we're keeping children here. So some final thoughts before we'll turn it to questions and anything else we'd like to talk about. South Bend saw a sharp turnaround. We were in crisis mode in 2010. We were hemorrhaging people. We've been able to stabilize and turn that around. Neighborhoods which were in free fall grew for the first time in half a century. So that allows us the opportunity now to decide, how do we want to grow? How do we take this and move forward? Which 10 years ago, we were just how do we stop the bleeding, which is a much different discussion to have. And then one thing we're definitely seeing locally and as well as nationally, that a national rise in home values and interest in urban living helps stabilize South Bend's population. But we need to do more. We need to make sure this growth continues, because as we know, the only way we paved our streets, the only way that we're able to pay our school teachers and we're able to keep our schools open is that we can keep growing as a community. We need to capitalize on the appetite for urban living. And with smaller household size, we need to recognize that not everybody wants to live in a traditional house anymore. Lots of people want to live in apartments. Lots of people want to live maybe in a smaller house. They don't need that big house out on the suburbs, which was the dream for so many years. And then we do need to, of course, monitor the impact of affordability issue and how the short-term rentals and second homes are starting to impact that. Like I said, on the east side and even some on the west side, we are seeing where the impact of people are buying up properties just to use them as short-term rentals. Unfortunately, the state of Indiana doesn't give us too many ways to deal with it, but it is definitely something I think we need to monitor and keep an eye on moving forward. With that, I think that was the last slide.
Yeah. Maybe I'll just reiterate one point there. We talked a bit on the shrinking household sizes, and again, with if you have the exact same number of housing units, but fewer people living in each housing unit, then your population shrinks. So you have some neighborhoods that you would consider very stable in the city, like say the Sunnymead neighborhood, just has a kind of a long history of decline just because there's fewer people in each housing unit. So I think it calls again for that variety in housing types, or because of shrinking household size, if you never change your housing stock or add any other housing units, you've sort of committed yourself to seeing population declines. And I think that's sort of the front edge of the iceberg, so to speak, that like Granger is seeing, is there's not adding multifamily units or not becoming more dense in terms of housing. So then we'll start the kind of that same trend that South Bend neighborhoods may have seen starting 40 or 50 years ago.
Thank you.
That was wonderful information. And with that, we need to open the floor to if there's any questions. Anyone have any questions or something that's on your mind? Because I do, but I'm going. And also from our Zoom audience, is there any, if there's any questions? Question.
Hi, it's Michael Carroll, member of Kappa Alpha Psi. I have a question. I was a census taker in this last review period. And what I found pretty interesting is when I would go out to homes and no one would answer the door. And when I go out there and I check in the system, there've been about 4 or 5 people that have been out to the same house. And I was wondering how, and I know there's other wheels turning here, but I was wondering, how do they capture those homes to have a accurate picture of the number of people living here?
Yeah, I'll run through the general process. So the census sends out the kind of census forms that you can reply online or fill out the form, and then they go through a whole series. If you don't reply, sending you
Right.
additional postcards and forms. And then if they still don't receive a response for that address, then they send out a census taker to make some visits. So they might follow up several times, try to knock on the door and see if anybody is there. If they don't get a response, then there's, I think, kind of a list of some other strategies they can use. Sometimes it's just talking to one of the neighbors. Let's say,
Right.
hey, how many people live there? Maybe not so much in the general population, but we saw, because the census was taken just as kind of the pandemic was getting started.
Yeah.
So it made it more difficult. But for like student populations where like there's students here in South Bend, and like normal times, of course, they'd be counted here, and like technically they were still counted here, but they might have gone back home to wherever they are. So the census worked with the universities for like
Right.
administrative records of like, well, how many students do you have, and how many have South Bend addresses. So I think it's a little bit more limited in the general population, but sometimes they can use administrative records to talk with the landlord of how many people are supposed to be living here, and then they, the best they can, try to assign the number of population to that particular address. If I can't remember the exact number off the top of my head, but South Bend, I think it was around 63% or so of households returned the form or completed the form either online or through the mail. And then they do follow up, and at least the Census General reports like well over 99% of addresses they come up with a number for. I think it's actually like close to 99.8 or so for our county, if I recall. So
Because-
I mean, there'll always be some margin of error, and we'll have to take them at their word. But I think the census regards it as a fairly complete count, or I think they think this was the most complete count ever completed as part of the census.
Okay, because I know a lot of homes that I visited, they were quite guarded. They were not willing to share a lot of information, whether it was pertaining to their household or the neighbor. So I just found that to be kind of difficult, very
Yes.
difficult, when I look at numbers, and I question the accuracy of those numbers. So,
Yeah, and I think that's something that every decade we have to deal with. And thank you for being a census taker, because it's kind of a thankless job and a very difficult one for sure. I think obviously we know, and this has come out in past censuses, that poor communities, communities that are experiencing high poverty rates, that have a distrust of authorities, that's obviously where you're probably going to see some undercount. I think that's almost inevitable. Hopefully, we didn't get to run the census, but so we can only deal with the data once it comes to us. But yeah, that's always something we're looking for, is making sure that every single person counts. Because something we didn't get into, obviously, is this impacts how much funding from the federal government the city of South Bend gets. This impacts how they draw our political district lines, and you want as many people as possible so that our neighborhoods are actually represented.
Yeah, and then of course, it's how all organizations do their planning. So how many students there are, where should schools be located, how in our office we do planning of what are population trends, what do we need to look at housing. I think sometimes people forget too that this is all the data that businesses use in making decisions about where to locate, especially like retail operations. They're not going to be interested in setting up in places where the population is declining. They want to look for those growth areas. I don't know if I can make a pitch 8 years in advance. So yeah, so always encourage your neighbors and your associates and especially those lower income populations and places people of color tend to have the lower response rates of it's very important to do, and hopefully we get that message out and maybe a more supportive administration at that time too.
Karen?
First, I want to thank you, the two of you, for your presentation. Very, very excellent. I have two questions. The first of which was one that you just mentioned. How is the financial impact determined in regards to how much this city would receive from the federal government based on the census? And what is that process and what does it look like?
He's been doing it longer than I have, so.
Yeah, there's and I don't remember the number. There's roughly a number per head that counts. I guess I can't give you a direct answer. It depends on, there's different federal programs that the city receives money based on population. Sometimes it's on kind of income / poverty levels as well. I mean,
For an example, I know the recent American Recoveries Act that was passed, they based what each geography will get on how large its population was. And they just took all theirs and divided it by the population. So obviously, if you have a larger population, you're going to get a bigger share of that pie, whatever. And the infrastructure bill that was passed a couple months ago, the same thing is, if you're a bigger community, you're going to see more resources, because it's just a formula that usually applies, say, 5,000 per person. So for every person you can add, you can make sure that you're seeing more revenue in your local community.
Information that once we start getting that financial impact, that's the way we can continue to educate and share that with our community as well, because it's so important when you begin to look at the level of federal support, and we should see a slight increase, but we may not. So I think that that's something that we can have some further discussions about.
One thing we're really afraid, I do know there are some just flat levels that the federal government likes. So every community over 1 million, this is a program for them. There are some programs that 100,000 is the cutoff. And we were very afraid that if we saw another year of decade of decline, we would drop under that 100,000 threshold, and then we wouldn't qualify for certain programs. Luckily, that didn't happen, and we stayed above that 100,000.
Just some more detail. Yeah, there's one of the key ones is that community development block grant that pays for often for affordable housing for lower income populations and other services to low and moderate income households. The federal program that's been around for close to 50 years now, and that's their I think 100,000 is the threshold to become what's called entitlement community. So basically, you automatically get that funding. So if you drop below that, then you kind of go into another pool that's more like a kind of competitive process, and you'd expect to receive less. And we often think, and it is important on the federal dollars, but there's also state level distributions that are based on population too. I think some of the roads monies that are distributed to the state is on a per capita basis, and there's some other obscure ones too. I think the riverboat gambling revenue from all the casinos around the state is distributed based on population, for instance. So yes, any increase we can show, especially and especially growing faster than other places, is helpful in that regard.
And my last question is more from a strategic, intentional planning perspective. As we begin to look at the numbers, and as we begin to look at the population shift, as well as the number of children that we have within our community, and the impact that it's going to have, not only the city, but on our educational institution, is there a process in place where we can begin to have this kind of long range planning so that there's no surprises the next 5 to 6 years? Because again, the data is very clear in terms of the demographic shifts that have occurred, and then the impact that it's going to have on our schools, but also the impact that the schools will have on our city, because we cannot be a strong city or a great city, but having great educational institutions, and then the economics. So I would just encourage that we have all this great information and that we will start having some conversations and start planning for it. So that's just a recommendation.
Okay.
I'm gonna take this and ask you a couple online questions, if that's okay?
Yes, please.
We've had some fantastic questions online, people popping in and out, but in addition to everybody here live, roughly about 17 watching over Zoom as well. So some great questions. I'll start with one. What explains the more dramatic population increase in the area north of Lincolnway?
The rise in households. It's 100% because houses that were vacant in 2010 were rehabbed and reoccupied in 2020. I mean, I'm sure there's more technicalities we could get at a block level, which we're still getting that data. One thing that's been upsetting this time around is the census data distribution has not been very good. We were able to get this data basically by searching through Excel sheets and hand doing things, which is pretty frustrating. But the areas north of Lincolnway, it saw a very large rise in households. Now, part of that is it saw a very large decline in households from the 2000 to 2010 perspective. So when you're starting from a lower, bottom, it's easier to have a dramatic rise. But we did see a significant return of households to those neighborhoods where a decade ago they were vacant. Do you want
to? We'll say in part of that area in Census Tract 6 is the near northwest neighborhood. There has been some new housing construction there, which always helps. And I hope maybe that's a takeaway here of it sounds a little obvious, but if you want your population to grow, need more housing. So I think that's not always easy given some of the financial particulars, and it's still a rough market in a lot of our city. But when we have the opportunity to have more housing, we should take advantage of that and work through these programs to get more housing. And just to touch on, from the 2020 census, as Joe was mentioning, the release has been slow, so we have some top line kind of population and race and age data, and that's about it. But coming next year will be some more releases on I guess there's some out on vacancy and a little bit more details on housing and other information that might be enlightening as well.
That sounds great. And she said, thank you. Another question, will the slides be available on the City of South Bend Community Investment website? I think they're just asking, please ask the speakers to provide some information on what tools, networks, and resources are available for those wishing to develop vacant lots, add accessory units, repair properties.
So the slides are already online. If you go to the City of South Bend website, it was a press release a few days ago, it was last month, but it's only a few press releases down. This whole slide deck is there for view if you want to look at it more. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to the Department of Community Investment. We'd be happy to dialogue more on the presentation itself. As for accessory dwelling units, the City of South Bend made them legal across the entire city, starting in the beginning of 2020 with the zoning updates that we've been doing. So now anyone, no matter the neighborhood, if they want to add an accessory dwelling unit to their house, so essentially a small unit, 800 square foot or less, that can be attached to your house. That can be, on a second floor of your house, or it can be a traditional, above the garage type thing. That is legal across the city. Mike, if you want to talk more about actually building on the vacant lots.
Okay. That's a whole nother lecture. Maybe I'll say for a asking question, I can contact our office for more. There's also there's a kind of local chapter of the Incremental Development Alliance. So these are kind of small scale developers, and like developers is probably even kind of too strong a term. So it's kind of people who say, you know what, I want to build a house on the vacant lot next door or in my neighborhood, and I may only do 1 or 2 or 3 housing units, my whole life. It's just kind of something I do on the side. They meet to do networking. It includes city folks and people on financial side, like banks, et cetera, as well as people who are interested in doing this or have done, who can provide a little kind of support and networking on vacant lots. Say, I don't know if they already own it or not. If you're looking for some vacant lots, you can find on like the MACOG website, for instance, a good resource on who owns that. That's kind of always the question. It's kind of an assumption sometimes that the city owns like every vacant lot there is in the city, and most are privately held. The city actually owns relatively few lots. So track down that owner. If the owner happens to be the city of South Bend, then you can request that. There's a process outlined through state law for how we sell that. But I think you heard in our intros, some both done some work on the zoning reform side to hopefully make it much easier than before on kind of checking the boxes to hit the zoning regulations to do infill development in some of these neighborhoods, particularly those that have been historically hard hit that we talked about tonight.
One thing I'll add, and this, again, like Mike said, this is almost obvious, and especially to residents of South Bend, but why population decline can be so harmful, especially if it leads to vacant lots, is if you take a street and there were 10 houses on that street 50 years ago, and they were all paying taxes and they're all contributing to the local businesses nearby, and now you only have 4. Well, the city still has to repave that street, and hopefully the school is still around, but it has less students. And the barbershop down the street, or the little grocer, or the restaurant 5 blocks away, they still want customers. But if you have less and less people on each street, that makes it more difficult to do the things we all want to do, which is drive on safe streets and make sure we have a vibrant economy. So yes, infill housing is super important for a city like ours.
Yeah, and just to defer that point, whether that block has 4 houses or 10 houses, it's the same cost to repave the street, to plow the street, to make sure the water main is still in good repair. So again, that's why I like to see, of course, these lots reoccupied, and why I also like to see that at a higher density of the more people you can spread that cost across, then the lower the cost is.
I'll add one more, and then if anybody else has a question live too, please step up and we'll turn the microphone over. One more online here says, is commercial/business census data available? If not, are there plans to capture this data and share the information?
So certainly not at this scale. I mean, the United States Constitution is what dictates that we have the decennial census, and that is why we do it. There's nothing like that at a business level that I know of. I mean, we do some studies, but
I don't know what the specific ask is. There's different kinds of economic censuses, and then there's also data on labor employment, where the firm is located, where the employee is located, and sometimes when those are different geographies, what the flow is in between. Generally, there is data on. Some is from the census, some is through the Bureau of Labor Statistics on the sectors of how many people are employed in manufacturing or in government or in retail sales, for instance, and that kind of data is available.
I will say one thing you didn't see today, which I think maybe a lot of people expect to see, is data on income levels and the median household incomes. That's not something the census, they used to take that data from the decennial census. Now they've set up the American Community Survey, which was one of our 10 questions at the beginning, which that comes out in different ranges of 1 and 5 years and so forth. And I have issues sometimes with it, but it's not something that we get from the 10-year census now.
Is there a website or link to see that data?
Specifically the census data or the income data?
They're not saying, but I assume they mean the income or
So
some of the other.
what is the census?
Business data that you're
This is
talking
one thing
about.
we complained about the census a little bit. They used to have a really great website and then it's gotten worse every year, it seems, and harder. It's data finder.
Yeah, there's a quick fix function on the census website that especially want to search for like by a geography, where you could type in South Bend and it would give you kind of information on those major topics with some, I think potentially some links if you want to go into more detailed.
They
data on
clarified
it.
the business and economic data is what they're really interested in.
Yeah, that's included, and it'll have all of the kind of data in different sections of the population housing data. Then I think it, if I remember correctly, I think it does then have some business data.
The labor bureau puts out the monthly unemployment number and how many jobs gained and lost each month. That organization, they have a decent website too, where you can search by metro, so you can chart how many jobs are literally in St. Joe County over time. That's the Bureau of Labor.
Is that where's the census? Who has the on the map?
Yes. Oh, there's also a really great one, I guess I should say. So the census runs a website called On the Map, which is purely for jobs and how many jobs are in a geography. The data is always 3 or 4 years behind because I think it's submitted they look at it from tax records and things, so it's always a few years behind. But it's On the Map census, and if you search that, it's a very nice tool to use. You can just type in South Bend, it'll zoom you to the city, and then you can say, I want to know how many jobs are in manufacturing. I think the most recent data is 2019, so it's all pre-pandemic still, but that would be a good website to go to.
All right, do we have any more questions? Okay, with that, I'm going to thank you all again for your information and
Yes, thank you for having us.
I'm going to turn over to Sarah Reeves to give us some closing remarks.
Good evening. On behalf of Delta Sigma Theta sorority, the South Bend Alumni Chapter, we'd like to thank both of our speakers today, Mr. Joseph Molnar and Mr. Michael Divita. Also, we'd like to thank the Civil Rights Heritage Center and George for our technical assistance today, and all of you in the audience. I hear loud and clear that our call to action is that we need to grow our city. There is much that we can do to start to educate, and we hope that tonight offered that option or that opportunity to you. Please check out the website that was mentioned today. Continue to have conversations so that we can be informed and do our part in making sure that we are active in addressing things that will affect our political district lines, as was stated, federal funds that are coming in, our schools, our businesses, etc. So with that, this evening, I say good night to you all and take care. Thank you.